Well, welcome to Christ and Culture. This is Pastor Jeff Short, your Bible teacher and cultural analyst. And today we're going to be covering a topic that I don't think a lot of Christians think about. And what prompted this discussion is the book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer by Eric Metaxas. And the subtitle of this book is Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, and Spy. Now, what is that all about? What is the spy part about? Well, there was a very big controversy last year when this movie came out about Dietrich Bonhoeffer that was based roughly on Eric Metaxas' book on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And the controversy is Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a theologian. He was a pastor. He was a Christian leader. Today we might call him an influencer, Christian influencer. And he decided to try to work against his German Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, and the Nazis during World War II, excuse me. He's not that old, World War II. And he decided to become a spy for the overthrowing of Hitler. So he's working against his own government to try to bring about the downfall of the Nazis. And he, in the process, had to become a spy. He had to involve himself in activities that are contrary, normally speaking, contrary to Christian morality. For example, he had to practice deception. He had to practice lies. He had to betray people in the Nazi Party who he worked with. And ultimately, his goal was to try to bring about the death of Adolf Hitler. He had to pass information, he had to pass plans and strategies to other members of the conspiracy to overthrow Hitler in order to bring about the death or demise of Adolf Hitler through some kind of assassination attempt. So he was involved in the plot to kill Hitler, to destroy Nazism, and to save his country from the evil that Hitler and the Nazis were bringing upon not only his nation, but the world. So all of that was taking place in the life of a pastor. And I think the big controversy was, and I think there are arguments on both sides, but the biggest controversial point was, why is a pastor being involved in these activities? There's one argument that says, well, yes, warfare, unfortunately, is necessary sometimes to bring about the greater good. Warfare is justifiable. There is such a thing as just war. We look in the Old Testament and we see that God sent the children of Israel out to fight the Canaanites. Joshua led in battle. And there were scenes and situations in the life of Joshua. For example, he was sent out to spy out. There were spies sent to spy Jericho. And they went into the house of a prostitute, and they had to fool people and deceive people into thinking that they were just simply using her services. And they were actually getting plans and plotting how to break into the city. And so Rahab, the prostitute, helped those spies from the children of Israel find out the best way to defeat Jericho. And Rahab, the harlot, the prostitute, actually lied to the officials there in Jericho, who came to her door and said, "Hey, where are these spies? We saw them going through here." And she said, "Oh, they went that way." Well, they didn't go that way. They went that way. So she pointed them in the wrong direction and lied to them. And God used that. And actually, in the New Testament, she's commended for faith. And she was rewarded in the Old Testament for her lies and deceptions in the cause for the children of God, the Israelites. So there's no question in the Old Testament that lying and cheating for the purpose of God's army, the Jews, was justified. And this is exactly the argument that this his name is James Olson, who used to be the head of counterintelligence with the CIA. And he's written a couple books on spycraft and espionage and all kinds of things. He was the former head of counterintelligence. And he is a Christian, and he was talking to Albert Mohler on the podcast Thinking in Public a year or so ago, and I listened to that, and I thought it was fascinating that here you have two Christians talking about the practice of spying and spycraft and espionage and a lot of things that are done in that process to gain information about evil nations, to prevent terrorism. A lot of things that are done in that line of work are actually normally ethically and morally sinful. For example, in the profession of spycraft, you have to be willing to lie to your contacts. You have to be willing to cheat and steal plans and documents and information. For example, during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the U.S. were butting heads, and there was a real possibility maybe of a third world war and nuclear holocaust, the United States sent spies and recruited spies from within the Soviet Union to gain valuable information about the weapons and plans and strategies of the Soviet Union. And a lot of these activities actually helped prevent a World War III so far. And it's still taking place right now. But a lot of these activities by U.S. spies involved lying, cheating, stealing. Some of the women who were spies had to seduce KGB officers to gain inside information about plans and activities of the KGB and the Soviet Union, and so on and so forth. A lot of ugly, terrible things had to be done. Even murder, assassination, killing. And it's just awful to even think about all of the things that have to be done. But as James Olson said to Albert Mohler in the interview, he said, these are all things that are being done that are necessary in order to keep the United States safe from terrorism and the Soviet Union during that time. And today it would be keep us safe from Russia and China, for example, who would do us ill. And there was no question that, for example, Adolf Hitler would have taken over the world if he hadn't been stopped. And no doubt there were spies lying and stealing and killing to try to prevent that. And some of them, many of them lost their lives in the process. It's highly dangerous, risky business. And James also made this argument as a Christian. He said, if you're willing to concede that war is sometimes justified, if you're willing to concede that there is a righteous cause, and I think we can all agree that opposing Hitler and Nazism was a righteous cause, if you're willing and able to kill for that righteous cause, then why wouldn't it be wrong to do all the other lesser evils like steal, deceive, cheat, seduce, betray, all kinds of other things, lesser ones than actually outright killing. So the logic is hard to argue with. If you're going to allow for a just war, then you have to also allow for a just stealing, a just destroying, a just betraying, a just seducing, a just assassinating, and so on and so forth. All the ugly things that are involved in war. And part of warfare is deceiving and taking by violent force and doing all the other ugly things. So if you think about it in the sense of, is it ever right and just to fight in a war? And if you say yes, then you almost have to, by necessity, say, yes, it is, of course, justifiable to practice spycraft. And so when we get back to the situation with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if you set that context, you realize that what he did to try to overthrow Hitler, to try to stop the Nazis, to try to end the war, was a good thing. And even though it is hard to think about in the normal course of our lives, of course, we don't want to. We are not allowed to. It is not justified in stealing. It is not justified to kill other people. It is not justified to betray and do all kinds of criminal activities. That's what it would be normally. It would be either immoral or criminal to do all of these things. These are the practices that the criminal element of our society does on a regular basis. Not in a time of war, not in the context of war, not in the clash of good and evil. They're just doing it for their own selfish reasons. But during war times, you have normal, ordinary people. For example, in World War II, there were many godly, born-again Christian men sent over to fight the Nazis and to stop Hitler. And they were being called upon by their nation, the United States, and we believe also they were called upon by God to stop this evil. And that means they had to kill Nazis. That means if they were involved in deceptive operations within Germany or in some of the occupied nations, they were called upon in the name of their nation and in the name of God to lie, cheat, betray, seduce, all the other activities that are involved in espionage and spycraft. They were called to do that for the greater good. Again, that's really hard to think about, and it's almost abhorrent to think about because in the normal context of life, these things would be totally off the table. There's no way you could justify that. But for example, like if you're a person involved in trying to overthrow Hitler, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer was, and you're in a planning of an assassination attempt of Hitler, again, something abhorrent if you take out the context of war and the just war and a righteous cause. If you take out that context, these things would be terrible. But if you're in the planning stages and someone in the Nazi party hears of the planning, overhears what you're doing, and then someone from the conspiracy goes over to that person and kills him in cold blood, that would normally be something atrocious, immoral, evil, unjustifiable, and totally contrary to the will of God. But in the context of war, that might be actually justifiable as a casualty of war. Because if that Nazi had gone and reported it to his superiors, then the conspiracy to kill Hitler and to end the war and oppose the Nazis would have been thwarted, and those people in the conspiracy would have been executed themselves. And that's exactly actually what happened to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler. Again, in the context of war, he was attempting to try to plan the death of another individual, Adolf Hitler. And we believe, as Christians, if you look through the logic of it, we believe that a plot to kill Hitler during World War II would have been justified and would have been a godly thing to do, actually. Because, again, you look at the Old Testament, Joshua and children of Israel, you look at King David and how he fought enemies, and they had to be involved in warfare. And then when you look at the New Testament and you go to the book of Romans, the Apostle Paul, the very Paul that wrote 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, he was also writing in the book of Romans, speaking about the government authority has to carry the power of the sword, and that is to execute wrongdoers. So the state is justified in killing wrongdoers for the good of the common weal of the people. And so there is an authority given to the state. And that authority sometimes uses capital punishment. And so we see today, for example, we see this gunman, Luigi, in New York, who in cold blood on the streets of New York, I've been to New York City before, very busy place. People are walking on the streets, on the sidewalks all the time. And here is a CEO of the United Healthcare, the insurance company that I have for my healthcare. The CEO is walking into a hotel for a business meeting, and this Luigi young man comes up behind him with a gun and shoots him in the back in cold blood on the streets of New York. Now, there is no question in my mind, I don't even have to blink twice, about the fact that this man deserves the death penalty. He deserved capital punishments. Genesis 9:6, if you take the blood of one man, your blood shall be required of you. And then it's repeated on in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible again. So there's no question that capital punishment is justifiable in the case of murder and other serious crimes like that. So this man, Luigi, who guns down someone, a citizen of the United States, I don't care what your politics, you hate the guy. I don't care if you hate what his company's doing. You cannot walk up to someone in cold blood and shoot them dead in the street. And if you do that, you're going to die according to the justice of God as found in the Bible. Well, if you're going to be able to do that, and you're able to go to war and fight in a war and do the things necessary in war. Now, again, it's very easy to sit back from our comfortable homes and our easy chairs and watch TV and say, oh, it's terrible, and or even watch the Dietrich Bonhoeffer movie. I do suggest that I recommend you watch the Dietrich Bonhoeffer movie that came out last year. It's called Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. It's the same title. And you will see that Bonhoeffer decided that he had to get involved actively in trying to oppose Hitler. Now, again, like I said before, you can fault him as a pastor doing that. And you could say, well, he should have left it to other people who were non-pastors, who were non-Christian leaders. He should have let those people do the dirty deeds and not directly involved himself in that. Okay, that argument does make sense. There is an argument that's saying we don't want our pastors and our church leaders and people who are preaching the gospel to be involved in warfare. Although there would be nothing wrong with that, practically speaking, we'd like for them to focus on what they were called to do as pastors and preachers. Okay, you can make that argument. While that is not an airtight argument, you can make that argument. But he felt that because of his position as a theologian and as an author and a respected scholar, his traveling would facilitate planning and communications between the different parts of this strategy to get Hitler. And so he felt he could be useful, whereas a normal citizen would not have access to travel and information and meetings that would take place. And he could go under the radar, so to speak, and the Nazis would not be the wiser. Now, he actually did part of his cover. Again, this is spycraft. He had a cover, and his cover was working with the Nazis, and that involved travel. So he did this whole spycraft. He worked as an espionage spy, and he had a cover, but all the time he was working against the Nazis, although he was working with the Nazis. So he was working with the Nazis in some capacities and working alongside a fellow German Nazis, although he was there to actually undermine their cause. And he was actually raising his hand and saying, Heil Hitler, Hail Hitler, and all that. He had to go through all the motions. So he's lying, committing acts of lying. And he was saying all the right words that the Nazis have to say and acting and deceiving all these people he's working around and with. In his heart, he's actually opposing the Nazis. This is what spies do. And that's why it was so intriguing to watch and listen to the interview with Albert Mohler and James Olson, who is the head of the counterintelligence, past head of the CIA. So he was involved, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was involved in all of these espionage techniques. I don't know if he actually tortured anyone or did any kind of course, he didn't do anything what they do today, like the waterboarding. That's an ethical question. Should waterboarding be used to extract information? If you have a terrorist, for example, and I'm not going to try to solve this problem in this dilemma. If you have a terrorist who is part of a terrorist cell in the United States and is planning on certain terrorist events to take place in the United States, and he will not tell you what these plans are, and he will not tell you when these operations will take place. So you have to say, well, okay, how do we get the information from him? He's not willingly. Well, you could use, techniques like sodium pentothal, I think, truth serum, it's called, where they inject it into the veins and the person is able to rattle and talk and almost like they're drunk, and they give away some information that way. Well, what if they don't do that? Waterboarding is involved where you're making the person, through the use of a rag and pouring water over his mouth, you're making him feel like he's going to drown in the water and choke to death and gag. And you come very close to doing that, but you actually don't kill the person. He feels like he's going to die. It's very painful, very much a torture technique, but the person is not killed. And he's actually not hurt physically. It's not like poking and with a knife or inflicting pain physically that is actually injurious to the person. This makes him feel like it's going to kill him, but it doesn't. And you waterboard the person until they give up the information, and saves lives, saves all of these many people who would have died if the terrorist attacks had gone on without that information. The authorities can stop these terrorist attacks before they happen, so on and so forth. So that's an example of whether you use really bad, normally atrocious, immoral, unconscionable practices for a greater good. And so a lot of people, when they look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer, they simply look at what he was trying to do during World War II. They hear that, oh, he was trying to kill Hitler. Oh, that's terrible. Christians should not be involved in that. Well, the truth is that anytime a Christian goes to war, they are involved in some of these aspects of questionable behavior that would normally be immoral and unjustifiable. But in the context of war, not for selfish reasons. Now, that's a big difference, because the criminal element in our society, they steal, kill, betray, cheat, seduce, undermine, disinformation, lie. They do all these things for their own self-betterment. It's all for selfish reasons, to get money. They do it for money. They do it for power. They do it for control. They do it for all of these selfish reasons, okay? Dietrich Bonhoeffer did not do what he did to try to undermine Hitler and destroy the Nazis. He did not do that for selfish reasons. In fact, he did them for selfless reasons, because he was willing to risk his life. He was willing to die so that Hitler, the evil, satanic, sinful Hitler, could be stopped. Unfortunately, the plan that he was involved in failed terribly. And it didn't happen. And they found out about it after the failure, and they traced and they reverse engineered the plot and they found all of the participants, and they put them in prison, and then eventually, just before the war ended, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was hung on the gallows and executed. So he died for his participation to try to overthrow Hitler. He was a victim of war. And so when you look at someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, before you judge him, before you, in the same way with spies, I would say today, whether there are people in the former Soviet Union, whether there are people working for the United States and the Western nations who have infiltrated communist terror cells, whether there are people involved in infiltrating organized crime, mafia, whether there are people down in Central and South America infiltrating the drug cartels who are lying and cheating and stealing, and actually, in many ways, to embed themselves into these, for example, the drug cartels. Some of the spies that are down there feeding information to the United States and other Western nations that are trying to stop this, they actually have to participate in some of the bad things that go on in the cartels. So they have to help implement the sale of these dangerous drugs that are killing young people all over the nation. And they have to compromise a lot of things in order to get into that situation where they can feed information to the authorities in the U.S. who will eventually oppose these drug dealers. So it's a very convoluted and twisted situation. It's war. It's a war by other means, and it's a very messy situation. But I think that if you look at Dietrich Bonhoeffer and you watch that movie and you get into a conversation with Christians and you say, how can a Christian steal, kill, deceive, lie, do all the things that are involved in spying? How can anything justify that? You have to get into a good conversation, and you have to open up that conversation and talk about the whole context of it. You have to talk about the New Testament, the Old Testament, and Joshua leading the army, and Moses leading the army, and David leading the army. And you have to look at what they did for the righteous cause. And you have to look in the New Testament. You have to look in the book of Romans. You have to look at the power of the state and how they're tasked with the duty of keeping order and bringing about justice. And they have the power of the sword to do that. They have to wield that sword correctly. And police today have to shoot at people. And when military operations go on around the world, soldiers have to point their guns at people and kill them and blow up homes and all kinds of things. Very messy. But the principle is that under normal circumstances, these things would be unconscionable and unjustified. But in the context of a righteous war, a just war, they can be justified under certain circumstances, because we see that in the Bible. So, very important discussion. We can talk more about this at another time. God bless.